Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Growing up in an independent Baptist church and school, I started every morning during the school year with the pledge to the American flag, the Christian flag, and the Bible. Then on Sundays when we went to church, the American flag was on one side of the stage, while the Christian flag was on the other. Flags are very important to conservative Christians and have a long history of being revered in the United States. In fact, they're so important that I incorporated one into the cover art of this podcast. With everything going on in the world today related to Trump's tariffs and all the other nonsense going on, one might wonder why we're dedicating an episode to flags. But as we'll see, the flags people fly reveal a lot about the causes they're promoting in their politics. In today's episode, we're going to be talking with Baptist News Global writer and Clemens Fellow Mara Richards-Bim about a piece she wrote last week titled A Visual Guide to the Elected Officials Who Fly Christian Nationalist Flags at the Capitol. But first, B&G's executive director Mark Wingfield was in Washington, D.C. over the weekend to cover the third annual Summit for Religious Freedom, which is put on by Americans United. One of the keynote speakers was historian Jemar Tisby.
You see that black Christians come from a historically marginalized place in this nation's history, certainly racially speaking, but also we didn't practice the kind of Christianity that the people in power approved of. Our brand of Christianity wasn't their brand. Holy but not hijacked means that we pursue our religion sincerely, but we avoid being hijacked by the promises of empire. The black Christian political witness shows us you can be holy, rooted in your faith or belief system, but not hijacked by an anti-democratic agenda. You can love the church and not want the state to force your beliefs on others. You can love Jesus and seek justice for all. Whatever your definition of holy is, don't let it be hijacked by fear. Don't let it be hijacked by lies. Don't let it be hijacked by the false prophets of power. When white Christian nationalism claims to speak for the church, we say, you don't speak for all Christians. Right. When they claim they are the true Americans, we say, we care about this country too. When they try to silence the stories of the Pierces, the Douglases, the Hamers, the voices of the ancestors will not be silenced. We come from a people who turn sorrow into songs, pain into prophecy, bondage into bravery. So we say today, our faith will not be hijacked, our history will not be hijacked, our hope will not be hijacked. As the forces of the world, we will stand, we will speak, we will not yield the floor, we will reclaim our time, because like Paul Hamer said, nobody's free until everybody's free.
Nobody's free until everybody's free. That's the difference between the causes of liberation and domination. Liberation won't rest until everyone is free, but domination won't rest until everyone submits to the highest power. And both of these impulses are present in Christianity, the impulse to work toward the liberation of self and neighbor, or the impulse to dominate one's neighbor. Many of us assume that Christians who wave American flags in religious settings are Christian nationalists, but that's not always the case. During a panel discussion that B&G's Mark Wingfield attended, Angela Dunker, who I interviewed for Highest Power Church and State in Episode 7, had this to say about her experience seeing a flag in a black church.
I think that one of the most important parts of my faith as a Lutheran is that we can have the flexibility to understand that the gospel has different functions for different people at different points in their lives. And I think the same can be true of the flag. And I think white Christian nationalism wants to tell us, and fundamentalism, I often emphasize for people, this is not a conservative movement inherently. It's a fundamentalist movement. And that's an important distinction, an important point to make. But the idea that the flag can only mean one thing, and that we have to have the same rules for every single church and every single person, that's a white Christian nationalist idea. And for anyone who was brought up in a high control religion, that's also a fundamentalist point, is that the same rules exist for everyone. So I think we need to have the flexibility to understand what the flag can mean for Jewish folks. And when I began my book research in Charleston, South Carolina, and tracing the steps of, sadly, ELCA Lutheran and white supremacist mass shooter Dylan Roof, I went to Mother Emanuel Church to pay my respects to Clement Pinckney and to those who were killed that day. And what I was told is that they keep an American flag on the altar at Mother Emanuel. And when I asked about it, I was reminded that that flag was first a resistance to the Confederacy. The specter of the Civil War were here in Virginia. It hangs over so much of this conversation. But I was told that that was a resistance to the Confederacy, and in the same sense, a reminder that the Black church is American, and it's something that America has to be proud of. So I think we need to recognize that there can be different rules in different places, that different symbols can mean different things, and we need to talk about what they mean and why they mean that in that place. So intersectionality is really, really important. The hierarchy is the point, the racial hierarchy, and certainly the gender hierarchy. There was a survey out recently, I think maybe an article in the New York Times, talking about young men becoming more religious, going back to church. If you dig underneath those numbers, what they're primarily attracted to, and not to diminish the young men we have coming to my church and other churches, but overwhelmingly, a lot of what they're attracted to is hierarchy. Right. They're seeking hierarchical church bodies. So we have to be aware of the connections between that and white supremacy.
With so much meaning and power, either for liberation or domination, wrapped up in various American and Christian flags, we need to have a conversation about the role flags play in the pursuit of religious and political power. So I sat down to talk with BNG's Mara Richards-Bim about her recent article titled A Visual Guide to the Elected Officials Who Fly Christian Nationalist Flags at the Capitol, which was published by Baptist News Global on April 3rd, 2025. So you mentioned in the intro to your piece that you spent 6 hours walking 19 miles through 6 office buildings looking at flags. And that's quite an experience that probably very few people on the planet will ever have. So maybe to start us off, what led up to doing this?
So I was there. I was in DC for the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship's Advocacy and Action Week. And so I had appointments with my representatives. And on the walk over, Jennifer Hawk, who is the, I don't know, head of advocacy for CBF, she knew that I had an interest in Christian nationalism and sort of how that has affected politics and all of that. And she just offhandedly said, you'd be really surprised at how many of these folks have these kinds of flags outside their office. And I was like, really? And so it didn't start necessarily that I was going to do them all, but as I started in, I don't remember which building, and as I walked the halls, the more I walked, the more I was like, I'm gonna do this thing. I'm gonna do this. This is what I'm gonna do today.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, I've never walked that much in one stretch. And by the end, and I was carrying a backpack, and in between, I did go to my meetings with Senator Cornyn's office, and Julie Johnson is my House rep. But I was exhausted by the end. And by the end, I was sort of like, do I really have to just finish this? But I was like, I've come this far. I have got to do this thing and see every single one's office. So.
Yeah, because I've heard that Matthew D. Taylor has written about how Speaker Johnson has some flags outside his office. So I knew there was like some of it here and there, but I didn't realize until I saw your piece how extensive it was with
Yeah.
so many of them.
Yeah.
Why do you think conservatives care so much about flags? Like, because we grew up pledging allegiance to multiple flags. Church stages have them. They're often used in missions conferences. Like, why
Yeah.
is allegiance to various flags such a big deal?
That's a really good question. I also, I mean, I think it's one thing for the American flag. I think that these flags that have been tied to extremism, there is this sort of like the lost cause of the Confederacy. Like it is symbolic of something to them about their identity, about their Southern identity, which is wrapped up in patriarchy and being a good Christian and all of that. And so I think that these flags, because they wouldn't necessarily pledge allegiance to these flags, but they are definitely making a statement in flying them outside their offices. And I think it's wrapped up in their identity, which was something I tried to get at also in the piece that, you know, the swastika also was around for a really long time. And at a certain point, a whole generation said we can't use this anymore because of the violence behind it. And they refuse to acknowledge how these flags have come to be tied to extremism.
Yeah. I read in preparation to for this conversation how flags started in ancient civilizations like Egypt
Hmm.
as military markers that represent various gods.
Yeah.
So it kind of seems like from their very beginning, flags have been tied to some kind of marriage between religion and politics.
Yeah, and there is, I can't remember where in the Hebrew Bible it talks about the Roman flags in Jerusalem and how like offensive that was. And so yeah, I mean going back that's a really great point. Going back historically, there is something militaristic about flags and how they've been used in religion. That's
Yeah.
interesting.
Especially when you think about how the gods were so territorial.
Right, right,
And
right.
you see a lot of things like I searched in a, a concordance basically,
Hmm.
like for the word flag, and I wasn't really
Hmm.
finding the word flag so much, but I was noticing like the banner and
Oh
different
yeah,
things
yeah,
like
yeah.
that. So,
Which I would take to be a flag, but
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah, that's
interesting.
interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
I thought it was also interesting how many of the officials you mentioned who fly Christian nationalist flags also voted against certifying the
Yeah.
2020 election results.
Yeah, I found, and I didn't set out like that wasn't a thing that I was, but I just kind of came across it with one of them. And so I was like, "Huh, that's interesting. I wonder how many." And so then I started comparing against, and yeah, it is quite a few, which I think is telling, right? Because these folks voted against certifying just hours after the Capitol was stormed and their own lives were in danger, right? And to then vote against certifying, I think was doubling down on the big lie and on this, I don't know, crazy ideology. So then it makes sense that they fly these flags, right? Like it
Mhm.
is part and parcel that these flags were present in mass numbers on January 6th. Um, and so their vote, I think, naturally ties to them flying it.
Yeah, it's like there's a correlation between their allegiance to Christian nationalism and their
Yep.
adherence to conspiracy theories.
Yes, yes. Very true. Very true. I didn't get into, I mentioned a couple in of folks, the obvious ones like Lauren Boebert and Marjorie Green. Uh, QAnon, like adhering to
Mhm.
QAnon, but I didn't go down that rabbit hole to see how many others have repeated conspiracy theories like that. But it would be interesting to see that overlap as well.
Yeah. Another thing I noticed, you mentioned Representative Clay Higgins being a member of the Three Percenter militia group and appearing at events with the Oath
Yeah.
Keepers. Like,
Uh-huh.
I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how people who are so obsessed with flags get caught up in militia groups.
Oh gosh. Well, he's an interesting guy. I mean, he was in the military as a military police officer, and then he got out and he was, sort of a regular law enforcement officer for a few years and was charged with, or was there was an accusation of excessive force, and he lied under oath and was about to be charged with that, and so he quit the force. And so I also find that interesting. I wonder how many folks, again, it goes back to the military, right? And the use of flags historically, militaristically. I think that there is some sort of overlap between folks who either were military or want to be, they had some fantasy about, you
Hmm.
know,
Being in the
being
Lord's Army?
be it right, and joining militia groups. I mean, I think there's definitely some like cosplay happening.
Hmm.
Uh and I was shocked. I had no idea that one of the representatives, like, I mean, he doesn't even lie about it. I mean, he is straight up all in with these groups, and people elected him. That I find really shocking.
Yeah, because we have the cosplay of the Jericho marches and things like that, where
Yes.
they're
Yep.
pretending to be ancient Israelites
Yep.
marching around
Yep.
buildings and stuff. But like, I feel like there's this a lot of like regular mainstream conservative evangelicals, they
Mhm.
don't seem to be concerned about the militia groups that I've talked with because
Right.
they almost feel like those people are these like wacko out there people, and they're like, I would never join a militia group. And
Hmm.
so it seems kind of hard to figure out how to get them to take these militia groups seriously.
Yeah, especially again, like I keep coming back to January 6th, but for me, that was this moment of like all of these factions came together. And at this point, for conservative evangelicals to not recognize the various threads and how their own theology supports those threads, I don't, I mean, it's just, I think, a willful blindness. And there hasn't been a real reckoning within the evangelical community about this.
Hmm. Yeah, because like they'll see a Paula White and she seems so
Right.
extreme, and it might be a Robert, you might be a Robert Jeffress who's against women
Right.
preachers to begin with. And
Correct.
yet like Robert Jeffress and Paula White are both fighting for the same,
Right.
raising of the Christian nationalist flag basically.
Yep. Yep. And Matthew Taylor makes that point as well in a lot of his work. That these folks, they have the same goal.
Hmm.
And somebody who's Southern Baptist may not recognize within their theology, the Paula White charismatic expression, but there are things within the theologies themselves that are connected, and then they also have the same goal. Um,
Yeah.
I would say the same is true with like the Catholic integralists, right? Like they theologically and maybe in how they practice more so than theologically are not aligned with either the Southern Baptists or the Charismatics, but they all have the same goal.
And they have I wrote an article last year with the Harrison Butker and JD Vance stuff with the traditional Latin Mass, how they have ties to militia groups and
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah,
So,
it's all connected, and yeah.
yeah. One of the flags you highlight is the Appeal to Heaven flag, which
Hmm.
is one that I see a lot at Christian nationalist worship rallies that I cover. Um,
Okay.
so like when I went to a worship rally with Sean Foyt in Raleigh, North Carolina, he had it draped over his merch table, and he also had
Okay.
it draped over his speakers, which was quite interesting. He's got it in his promotional materials, and people all over the place were waving them. And so, like,
Yeah.
from my perspective, it's concerning because of like how you mentioned in your piece, it's tied to Christians taking dominion over non-Christians.
Yeah.
But for a lot of the people who are waving them, they just think they're simply at a worship gathering appealing to
Yeah.
God on behalf of the nation. And like, how could you possibly have a problem with that? And so, like, I guess one my question here would be, how do you process their presumed innocence despite the harm that they're causing?
I mean, I think this goes back to willful ignorance. I think at this, I mean, I guess somebody could truly not have any clue of the conversation over the last few years of how the appeal to heaven flag is tied to extremists. I think it would be hard to be unaware of the controversy, given that Samuel Alito flew it, given that, the House Speaker flies it. I mean, so much has been in the press. But I guess if you live in a little echo chamber and you have no idea about the controversy around it, you could really believe that. I don't think the bulk of the people flying it live under a rock. I think they are at least aware of the controversy. I think there is a lack of curiosity around what that controversy has been about. And for those who do know what it's about, it's again a willful ignorance. It's like the folks who hang on to the Confederate flag and say, oh, but it's just Southern identity. And it's like, it's part of me. Or folks, who elevate the swastika and think like, but it's been around for so long. At some point, these folks are willfully making a choice to use a symbol that they know has lost its original meaning. So I don't know how you differentiate between those who live under a rock and really don't know
Yeah.
and those that just willfully turn a blind eye. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how you differentiate or how you break through. Um, and I don't know that we can break through as long as politicians are flying them. They well know what the controversy is about, and they well know the changing meanings of this flag and its ties to extremism, and they choose to turn a blind eye. So it's going to take, I think, bold leadership from conservatives to say, you know what, we can't use this flag right now because it has this other meaning.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to a conversation we're experiencing a lot recently, in that there's this unwillingness to face the dark things of our past. And it's
Yeah.
really odd because like these are Christians who say they believe in sin and they believe everyone is sinners, and yet it's like I'm still kind of feeling this out myself, like how I want to like explore this, but it's like I feel like the way they take their sin and put it 2,000 years ago on the cross is
Mhm.
almost like they're not willing to deal with their sin. Like we're gonna put it elsewhere on somebody else, and
Mhm.
and then we're innocent and we're righteous and we don't have to actually self-reflect on the harm we're causing in the world today because like, our motives are pure and everything. And there's just this presumed innocence that
Mhm.
really feels tied to this white supremacist narratives of the past couple hundred years.
And I would add to that, I also think when they are willing to talk about sin, it is all sexual in nature. Like it is an individual's sexual sin, whether it is homosexuality, whether it is sex outside of marriage, whether whatever it is, right? I am of an age where the purity rings were a thing, right?
Hmm.
And that whole culture, and there's something about, I agree with you. There is something about like for people who are so focused on sin, there is again a willful ignorance around corporate sin. And what does it mean? What does societal sin look like? It's they focus solely on the individual. And if you are leading a quote unquote pure life by their definition, that sort of reconciliation happened 2,000 years ago on a cross, but they're not willing to look at corporate sin and their role in it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today, and I hope everybody
Yeah.
goes and reads the article.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
I thought it was interesting how she mentioned these flags are wrapped up in their identity and in their power over others. We see this even in the words from the Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag that we opened up this episode with. It starts by pledging allegiance to the Savior for whose kingdom the Christian flag stands. So suddenly we're talking about a kingdom. And of course, that language is used in the Bible, but if we don't recognize the culturally situated nature of kingdom language and of how empire power dynamics are subverted, then we're going to pursue that kingdom today in ways that harm our neighbors. And that's precisely what we see in the close of the pledge. It says, "with life and liberty for all who believe." Notice it doesn't say life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Happiness isn't really on the radar for those who interpret reality as a kingdom hierarchy of authority and submission. And notice who life and liberty are for in this kingdom. Not for everyone, but only for those who believe their theology. That's what we're seeing in this Christian nationalist cause today. It's the pledging of one's allegiance to a cause represented by various flags that just so happen to put white conservative Christians in charge, not for the liberation of their neighbors, as Jamar Tisby and Angela Denker talked about in our intro, but for domination over their neighbors, as Mara Richards-Bim wrote about in her piece about Christian nationalist flags. That's it for today. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
A flag is a symbol, and symbols have different meanings for different people, even the same people at different points in their lives. I just think it's really interesting. Juneteenth became a national holiday. I hope it stays that way.
Yeah.
But you know, there's actually an official Juneteenth flag. And the colors of that flag are red, white, and blue. And it's for the very reasons that you mentioned, Rachel, to assert that black people are American too, or U.S. Citizens too, and not to have this rigidly fundamentalist kind of definition of who is a quote-unquote true American. And so I don't think we should cede every symbol or every word to the right wing because they've misused it. Some of these things are worth fighting for. That, and you mentioned, patriotism versus nationalism. I'll just quote the great James Baldwin, who, by the way, was raised in the church but did not identify as Christian. And he said, "I love America more than any other country in the world. Exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually."
Amen.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.